truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. One of the questions I often get asked, mostly from DC reporters, is, what's the status of the right? What are conservatives doing? What does it mean now? Is it Trumpism? Is it populism? Is it neoconservatism? Is it just a bunch of rhinos? What is it? And it's an interesting question. It's a complicated question. Here to help us answer that, because he wrote a book called The Right. Here to help us answer that is Matthew Continetti. Thanks, Matthew, for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We met a few years back when I had just started running for Congress. A mutual friend introduced us, and we had dinner, and and that's the end of the story.
2 years later, here we are.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Hell, it's been longer than 2 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
4 years. Yeah.
Good to see you again. So your new books, the Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism. Really interesting kind of historical narrative of all the different strains of conservatism. But maybe let's start in the modern era real quick, and maybe that will tell us why you decided to write this book, perhaps, because maybe you get that question as often as I do. You're a prominent analyst, author. You were from American Enterprise Institute. I didn't really read a lot of your bio, but that's who you are. Written many books before this as well. So do you get this question a lot, and how do you answer it?
Well, I think everyone is interested in what the right looks like today and where it's headed. And this is good for me, I suppose, because I've been interested in this question really for the last decade. It was after Mitt Romney's loss in 2012 that I felt that I really needed to begin to understand American politics better and also the American right better. Why was it so hard for Romney to win a race that I had thought was very winnable for him in 2012? What were some of the critiques of Romney that were being put forward by forces on the right, especially the populist right, and where had they come from? And so it was really after 2012 that I began the research, the writing, and the teaching that's culminated in this book, The Right, where I try to say, here's how we got where we are now. And one of the lessons of this history is a lot of this stuff is not new. A lot of the arguments we're having, a lot of the forces at work in our politics today, they're recurring phenomena.
Does it make you feel better
history.
or worse?
Well, I think it makes me feel better in a way because America has gotten through a lot. Yeah. And sometimes I think we're often tempted to despair on the right. We see that we're
see that a lot.
We're overpowered or overwhelmed. But I think history guides us to an understanding that these fights are winnable, and this country is a great country, and it will persevere.
It does occur to me, and I would agree that these strains have long existed. You can find whatever op-ed or article from decades ago that is expressing the same sort of doom and gloom that people express now, as if it's the first time we've ever seen whatever it is, problem X, Y, or Z. So do you think people are just wired a certain way? And there will always be a strain of any given population that is human to be wired with a certain political disposition. And you can categorize those political dispositions and label them, the best you can. In the end, everybody's an individual and kind of on a spectrum. But is that what it is? Is it just human nature that there's about half of us will be liberal leaning in the sense that they believe that more solutions can come from above? And then the other half will be the opposite of that, more conservative leaning. And then within that, there's going to be this sort of populist movement. My next question to you is, how do you define populism? I have my way of defining it, sure. Which isn't, I don't define it kindly, but I'm curious what you would call it, because you said you noted populism rising up against Romney in the 2012 era. So what is populism?
Sure. Well, just I'll start by asking the question about, where do we get these ideas? How do we fall on either the left or the right? And one of the thinkers I discuss in The Right, my book, is Thomas Sowell, who wrote a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone called A Conflict of Visions.
Best book.
Where he
it's one of the best.
Yeah, where he really kind of says that it really comes down to two different views of looking at reality. And these views, we can trace them back through history, and they are present in our politics today. So I definitely would recommend that book.
Right.
On populism, I define populism as anti-elitism and anti-expertise. Mm-hmm. And so I think populism is an integral part of American politics. I mean, we can trace the roots of American populism to before the American Revolution. We can see it present in the American Revolution. We see it in the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And almost like a sine wave, it comes and goes over time. And part of populism emerges when the elites, the people in charge, Republican or Democrat, business elites, cultural elites, whoever has a position of authority in our country, either don't recognize or can't address significant social, cultural, and economic change. Mm-hmm. And another element that's much more visible in our politics today is this idea of resistance to so-called experts. Mm-hmm. So you see a lot, especially with regards to the pandemic, where the Fauci and the CDC and people who are supposedly the experts at managing the pandemic give advice that is contradictory or doesn't turn out to be correct. And so the populist impulse is to say, these experts don't know what they're talking about.
Sure.
So those are the two components of populism to me.
Yeah, that's a kind way of looking at a lot of these strains, because I guess I would fall into some of these categories. It's not that I guess the difference between maybe me and somebody else who would consider themselves an angry populist is they trust no experts. And in my opinion, you got to take it case by case. Should you trust Fauci? Well, no, because I mean he's indicated over a series of missteps that we shouldn't necessarily trust him. That's an extreme case, and everybody knows about it, obviously. So because skepticism is healthy, and if that's how we're defining populism, I don't think there's anything really wrong with it. As long as, like any movement, it can get to be too much. Absolutely. Oh well, they have a degree, so they must be wrong. Well, that's dumb. That's not analytical thinking, not even a little bit. What I see a lot of it is I would describe liberals as populists, because I view it as telling people what they want to hear instead of the truth. And I see right-wing populism resulting in very bad ideas that are very anti-conservative. Best example was when there was a large movement on our side trying to fight for $2,000 stimulus checks to everybody. I mean, not means tested. Has nothing to do with whether you lost your job or not. There's nothing less conservative than just giving out free money. I mean, what's the limiting principle? So why not 3,000? If 2,000 is good, then shouldn't 3,000 be better? So populism, I think, leads you down these roads because it's doing what feels good. And imagine that. What is popular? And what is popular? Well, it's giving people free money is popular. Populists, they definitely associate themselves with the anti-war movement. Lately, that's been very extreme with the conversation about Ukraine, Russia, to the point where I think many of those types have appear to me to be pro-Putin. I mean, that's what it appears to me. If you're repeating his talking points and the Russians are taking your clips and putting them on Russian propaganda TV, something is wrong. I'm not sure where that comes from. And maybe it's not right to associate it with populism per se, but it's just these interesting strains that this Russia invasion has really revealed. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, absolutely. Just a little bit on populism. Before I turn to the war, you hit it on the head, which is that populism is unmediated, and it wants the will of the people expressed, right? And it has a skeptical view of institutions, right? And I think for conservatives are institutionalists. We like institutions. They're here for a reason. We don't want to challenge them. The ideal is to have the populist sentiment, this grassroots populism that's a recurring feature in American life, to work with conservatism, to build public policy solutions.
The feelings of the people eventually have to be channeled with a governing philosophy, and populism is anything but a governing philosophy. And so the same thing I say about liberalism. It's not a governing philosophy. It's a set of feelings. Conservatism is a governing philosophy, limiting principles, standards, questions that we might ask. And that's where populism, I think, really fails as even, it's more of an emotion to me than it is really a philosophy.
You sound exactly like one of the figures in my book, Frank Meyer, one of the chief theorists at the National Review in the 1950s and 60s, who made exactly this case that populism is not conservatism. No. But I do think what we have found in the history of the right, as I discuss in the book, is that when these two forces have worked together, they have achieved great results. It's exactly as you say, it's channeling. Okay,
so let's talk history. Let's go to the book. So it starts in the 1920s. Why is that an important time to think about this? End of Woodrow Wilson era, I suppose?
Yeah, but there are two reasons. One relates to your comments about intervention in Russia. The first reason is the 1920s, I think, was the time when we can see what conservatism in power look like without anyone thinking of it as conservative, right? It was the 1920s when it really came clear that the progressive impulse was not going to be in the Republican Party. It was really going to be in the Democratic Party. And there was such exhaustion on the part of Americans after the experience of Woodrow Wilson, after the experience of the Great War, World War I, that they wanted that phrase we hear a lot of, a return to normalcy. And so they gave the presidency to Warren Harding and his vice president, who became president in 1923, Calvin Coolidge. So I start there because I want to see what America is like when conservatives were in charge, but conservatives, they didn't even think of themselves as conservatives.
Yeah, when did this label even begin?
Exactly. That doesn't start until after the real change in America. And the change in America was FDR and the New Deal.
I see.
When all of a sudden people who are opposing FDR and the New Deal start to say that they are trying to conserve the Constitution and the free market.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about the right in the 1920s is, in some respects, it resembles this populism that you were describing today. The right in the 1920s was non-interventionist.
Yeah.
They did not want to be involved in Europe. The right in the 1920s wanted to restrict immigration, right? An important issue to populists. The right in the 1920s supported the tariff and protectionism, which relates to some of the debates we're having about industrial policy vis-a-vis China today.
Yeah.
So another reason I started the book there in the 1920s was the resemblances between the right in the 1920s and the right in America today. And so it's a reminder, one of the themes of the book is, this is nothing new. Nothing we see is new. And we need to look and learn our history in order to understand the arguments and also some of the rebuttals to the arguments from our opponents.
Bring it back to the modern era. What concerns me about the folks who are, basically anti-Ukraine, I'll stop short of saying they're pro-Russia, even though all indications sometimes point that way, depending on who we're talking about. It's one thing to be anti-war. There's literally not a single politician, Democrat or Republican, saying we should go to war with Russia. These people are anti-aid to Ukraine. They're anti-posting nice things about Ukraine. Like this offends them. They call it propaganda. They try to promulgate Putin's talking points about the history of Ukraine and Russian concerns. They make up conspiracies about weapons and being created in biolabs supported by the U.S. I mean, these are lies. Yes, there are biolabs, but they're not weaponized. And if anything, and our support for them ensures that. It's really easy to research these basic facts. And so I'm wondering what motivates it, because there's a big difference between that and, conservatives or right-wing populists back in the 20s and before that saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't go to world war. Right. Because there's a huge difference between these two people. And I'm just wondering, are maybe some of our more modern, opinion commentators are reaching a little bit, kind of grasping for straws, trying to be a part of something, even though this isn't the time for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. But, too, in my research for the right, I found that one of the dangers and temptations for any political persuasion is to be kind of pushed to the fringe. And as a result, begin to view America and what America does as corrupted or even baleful and evil. And you can see this on the left, but you can also in our history see it among parts of the right.
Yeah.
some of the worst elements in the America First movement, opposing American aid to Britain, right, ahead of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. You can see it in some of the splinter groups that broke off from mainstream conservatism in the 1960s over the war in Vietnam, where these groups not only opposed the war, they started critiquing America, calling America fundamentally corrupt, sounding in many ways like the radical left. When I look at parts of the American right today, and especially the parts of the right that are diminishing Putin's illegal and unprovoked invasion against a sovereign country, I see the same strains. You see that in other contexts, these critics will say that America is not worth defending, that America is lost. And I fundamentally reject that idea.
Well, I reject the idea that it's America first to let Russia and China establish the world order. I mean, that doesn't seem like an America first notion at all. And I think it does come back to this sort of sense of resentment and this belief that I've really only heard from liberal professors at elite institutions, that everything America touches is bad. Every foreign policy action results in failure. Every single one. Now, that's quite the argument to make, but they effectively make it. It's a difficult one to make objectively speaking, because I mean, what's the other historical narrative that you can compare it to? You can't, right? You can't compare it to anything because history is what it is. And there's just this belief that everything would just be better if America had never touched anything. And I never thought I'd see it to such an extreme amount on the right. I do understand people's frustrations with the Iraq War. That's understandable. I'm not sure why people can't see the difference between us doing regime change in Iraq versus helping a sovereign nation defend itself from another sovereign nation. It's this inability to distinguish concerns me a little bit. It is a very small minority of people. I mean, we see the polling on this, but it's just something that's concerned me as of late. And trying to figure out where it comes from is interesting, noting that it's been around a while. All right, let's go back in history again. So people are tired of Wilsonian progressivism. Maybe real quick, can you hit on what exactly are they tired of? It's not just the war.
Well, they're tired of some of the consequences of the war. Among them, the social disruption and in many cases repression that accompanied American involvement in the war. They are tired, and here's a familiar word, of inflation that accompanied the war economy that Wilson began to form. They're tired of another familiar idea, the pandemic that accompanied American involvement in the Great War. So there was kind of an exhaustion with the Wilson presidency. Wilson himself was ill for much of the end of his presidency, and the conditions on the ground that resulted in some incredible Republican landslides in 1920 and 1924. But it did not last long.
Mm-hmm. And then we move on to Calvin Coolidge. What did he do for the conservative movement? What would he have called himself if not a conservative?
He would call himself an Americanist. Mm-hmm. He believed in Americanism, just like Warren Harding, who he succeeded. Calvin Coolidge is a very important figure because he kind of establishes the basic idea system of the American right. He is, of course, very much pro-market, right? Free enterprise. He also grounds his beliefs in the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and has reverence for them. And he also has this idea that America's spirit needs to be strong if our country is going to be strong. And so some type of public religion, civil religion, it doesn't necessarily any one sect or belief system, but just the idea that religion is important to the moral health and indeed the strength of a nation comes from, you can see that present in Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, and then you certainly see that present in modern conservatism. I mean, and eventually we get to establishing modern conservatism in this sort of Buckley, Russell Kirk kind of vein, where we talk about the integration of economics, politics, and culture. That's Russell Kirk's kind of trifecta. But we're not there yet. So Calvin Coolidge ends in his presidency. It doesn't seem to me through any fault of his own, but we're getting into the Great Depression now.
Right.
And
he
so
decides he doesn't want to run. He was really heartbroken by the death of his son. Actually, he doesn't run for a second term in 1928. Much to many people's surprise and shock. And instead, the Secretary of Commerce during the 1920s, Herbert Hoover, becomes the Republican nominee. Coolidge did not like Hoover, but he didn't fight the nomination. And Hoover, when he was president, he still retained some of those kind of progressive ideas that had been present in parts of the Republican Party for the beginning of the 20th century. And so he did not listen to the Secretary of the Treasury during the Harding-Coolidge period, Andrew Mellon, who was very much cut taxes, cut spending, those traditional conservative economic concepts. Hoover tried tax raising, he tried public spending and deficit spending. Once the Great Depression started, nothing worked. And Hoover's personality did not contrast well with his challenger in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about FDR and the New Deal. And again, coming off of the Great Depression, Americans are, they want to be taken care of. They've had a rough decade of it, and it sort of opened the door for these New Deal economics, this sort of paternalism coming from the government, which was hard for conservatives to combat for quite a while.
Oh, absolutely. A combination of the conditions of the Great Depression and also the personality of FDR put the Republican Party in a very undesirable position for much of the 1930s, really reduced it to almost a rump. But it was during this time when we see conservatism define itself in opposition to the New Deal, in opposition to Roosevelt's enormous expansion of the reach and the complexity of the federal government, and grounding that opposition in a constitutionalism, a sense that FDR was going beyond the powers granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So we see that continuing theme. But it was not necessarily a popular position at all. And FDR was able to really just trounce the Republican nominee in 1936, a guy named Alf Landon, who was called the Kansas Coolidge. And when Landon went down in just a terrible landslide defeat, it scared the Republican Party elites into putting up nominees who would resemble that kind of Coolidge-Harding 1920s conservatism. And so the party, for many years, tried to find a middle ground between, fiscal prudence, responsible government, but also recognizing that if they challenged the New Deal frontally, they would probably lose at the polls.
And the next Republican president we have is Eisenhower.
Yes.
And so what are the movement's thoughts on him?
Well, it's funny to think about because here we have Dwight Eisenhower, a two-term Republican president, hero of World War II, the first time you have a Republican elected in 20 years, and yet the conservatives of the time did not like Eisenhower. Why didn't they like Eisenhower? Well, they were critical of Eisenhower's acceptance of the New Deal. Now, Eisenhower understood political reality, but for the conservatives of the 1950s, you had to try to subvert the New Deal, that is, undo it, repeal it. Eisenhower didn't want to. There was also the question of foreign policy. It's after World War II that anti-communism becomes the glue that binds together the American right. And for the conservatives of the 1950s, despite Eisenhower being a Republican, they did not view him as sufficiently anti-communist and anti-Soviet. He was more willing to continue the program of containment of communism that started under President Truman, a Democrat, than he was to adopt the conservatives' preferred position, which was rollback of communism.
Yeah.
So for those two reasons, the conservatives of the 1950s were very critical of Dwight Eisenhower and of his vice president, Richard Nixon.
And is that where neoconservatism came about, right? This sort of anti-communism push, Democrats that maybe believed in the New Deal, but also thought we need to be hard on communists. Now, I'm not sure how that's related to the current usage of the word neocon.
Oh, yes.
I think the current usage is just meaningless and stupid, but I really do. I mean, it's just like, basically, if you believe in any foreign policy, you're a neocon. That's kind of seems what it sounds like to me. But that's where it came from. It was actually a thoughtful label back then. It was a real thing.
It has what neoconservatism meant when it emerged in the 60s and 70s has very little to do with what people think they are referring to today when they call someone a neoconservative.
Yeah. It's just basically that means that somebody said something I don't like, or I heard a bad thing online, and I believe everything I read online.
I know.
So Dan Crenshaw's a neocon.
Yeah.
Like, that's really what it means.
Well, yeah.
I say it how it is.
For the original neocons, they were anti-communist liberals. So they were Democrats, but they really did oppose the Soviet Union. They believed in containment. Maybe not rollback, but they did think that America had to have a hard line against the communists. But they didn't start moving to the right and thinking of themselves as neoconservatives until really the late 1960s and some of the domestic developments in this country, the revolt of the students across the country on campuses, the counterculture, the rise of drugs and crime, all of these things made these anti-communist liberals begin to wonder whether they were on the wrong side of some of these political issues. And they started making alliances with some of the conservatives who had been around for decades or before and thought of themselves as conservatives for all that time. So the neoconservatism, when it really came into being, as I talk about in the right, it was a domestic phenomenon. It's not until much later that it becomes associated with foreign policy and specifically the war in Iraq.
Yeah. People like labels, right? Like, people like labels that they think sound insulting. I'm not sure. I'm curious in your research if you found when the term rhino came about.
Right. Yeah, I know. Well, before there was rhino, a Republican in name only, there was a Me Tooer. Now, different meaning from what we hear when we hear Me Too today.
Interesting.
But at the time of the New Deal and into the 40s and 50s, the conservatives didn't like Republican politicians who wouldn't challenge the New Deal square on. And these conservatives referred to those politicians as Me Tooers. So there's always been this kind of critique of Republican politicians for not standing up enough for conservative principles, not fighting hard enough. You see this again and again. When Barry Goldwater wins the Republican nomination in 1964, Phyllis Schlafly, the great conservative activist, publishes a book called A Choice, Not an Echo. The book is an attack on the Republican kingmakers in New York and Washington who control the nomination process to put up these Me Tooers who won't stand for conservative principle.
Yeah.
You see some similarity between what she's saying and arguments today.
Yeah, you absolutely do. It's just this string of slogans. They pop up continuously in every single election. I mean, you can write the script for any primary election these days. So exactly what your opposition is going to say. Doesn't stand up enough, sides with Democrats. Like, what's your evidence? Well, I mean, if you ask me for specifics, that's a different story. But I read it online, right? I'm just sorry. It's just I'm jaded about what I see.
I hear you.
Okay, going back in history again. Talk to us for a little bit about the complicated relationship with the civil rights movement and how it didn't. I mean, curious what your opinion is on it, how that sunk Barry Goldwater, who many of us would consider to be probably one of the first real conservative intellectuals, also politician, right?
Well, I think in the story I tell in the right, I think the biggest failure of the American conservative movement was its opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And many of the heroes in my book, including William F. Buckley Jr. and Barry Goldwater don't cover themselves in glory during these battles over civil rights.
Is it completely, I don't need to stop it, is it completely accurate to say the Republican Party was opposed? Isn't there, I mean, because if you look at ratio-wise as far as who voted for it.
Yeah, well, there were many Republicans. I mean, this is where we have to make some distinctions. I mean, there were 2 civil rights bills passed under Eisenhower, right? There were many Republicans in the Senate, including Senator Dirksen of Illinois, who were pro-civil rights 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was the self-identified conservatives who became the basis of the conservative movement in America who opposed these civil rights bills. And they did so in a variety of ways. I'll talk about...
And that's an important distinction, because it's not necessarily like the Republican Party, I believe, if I'm correct in this, voted proportionally more for civil rights than Democrats did.
That would make sense to me, since many of the Democrats of this era were Southern Democrats and really the architects of segregation.
Right.
And we always have to make these distinctions when we talk about the right between the Republican Party and the conservative movement, and then between the conservative movement and the conservative intellectuals and writers, and then between different groups of those. We always have to decompose these things rather than so often, especially in the media, that they're just lumped together. With Goldwater personally was an anti-racist. He helped desegregate the Senate cafeteria. He helped start the Arizona NAACP. But he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act on constitutional grounds. And this became a problem for him in the general election of 1964.
Because your average person who can tell right from wrong, in the civil rights movement, it was right. Like it was as in correct. And the average person can feel that. And they don't understand these sort of high-minded arguments about process and constitutionalism.
That's right. I mean, and especially in Goldwater's case, to your point about these differences between party and candidate, Goldwater was the nominee of a party whose platform pledged a Republican president to implement the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This bill.
So it's confusing,
So it was just confusing to people. Yeah. And so he's one case. Someone like William F. Buckley Jr., who is a big figure in my book, the founder of National Review, and in many ways the modern conservative movement, he actually opposed the Civil Rights Acts put under Eisenhower. And some of the language he used, I think, is racist. I mean, he was making culturally racist arguments. He later repudiated all of that. But you saw there one strain of the right and how they opposed civil rights versus Goldwater, who was just on these very strict constitutionalist grounds. And I think that distinction is important. But there's no question that when I look back on the history of the right, this was a huge missed opportunity for American conservatives.
And then after that, we get Nixon.
Yeah.
So what was his influence on the conservative movement? He's not really looked at as this sort of classic conservative the way Goldwater, Reagan, and Buckley are.
No, and he did not think of himself as one. He viewed a lot of those names that you just mentioned with suspicion, especially William F. Buckley Jr. And his administration did some things that really turned off conservatives, whether it was his recognition of Red China, the People's Republic of China, which the conservatives opposed at the time. Also, people forget Nixon imposed wage and price controls to try to clamp down on inflation ahead of his reelection.
It's interesting. Did those work, by the way?
Of course, they never work. Right? They worked for long enough, as Milton Friedman predicted, and Milton Friedman would say that those were some of the worst. That was some of the worst things Nixon did. So for these reasons, the conservatives were always skeptical of Nixon up through his reelection in 1972. Ironically, it wasn't until the Watergate break-in that there were some people on the right who started defending Nixon just on partisan reasons and such. But Nixon and Watergate and the scandal that consumed the city and this country for basically for 2 years between the break-in and then Nixon's resignation in August 1974 also put the conservative movement in a real bind because they that even though they didn't trust Nixon, they understood that a Republican presidency is the best chance of getting their policy objectives accomplished. And yet, here you have this very flawed leader who is bringing down his entire party along with him.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that, of course, led to now Carter, right?
Yeah,
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, we had a little Ford interlude,
Ford,
so 76, Carter's elected.
And Americans weren't so happy with that. Then we get Reagan. What is Reagan's influence on us today, you think? Obviously, he's still looked upon kindly. We have Lincoln Reagan dinners. That's what we do. Yeah. And again, like there's the Goldwater Institution. These are major names that we still look at fondly. What did Reagan tap into at the time, you think?
Well, there's a lot. Reagan's effect on conservatism, on the Republican Party, on America, and on the world is profound. And in fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book, The Right, is I wanted to kind of broaden the portrait of the right that is usually drawn. Reagan is such an important figure in history that people tend to just focus on him. So I wanted to include him, but as just one character in a bigger cast. But I'll talk about a couple ways he influenced the right. One was he, in my view, exemplified what was possible when you combined populism with conservatism. And he kind of integrated both of those tendencies and channeled the populist anger at Jimmy Carter in the direction of the country in the late 1970s to positive ends.
Yeah.
Right? He didn't scapegoat anybody. He didn't single out groups for attack. He was just talking about big government, right? So in some ways, Reagan's success kind of warps our view of the American right because we think it's all Reagan. But that ability to successfully combine populism and conservatism is extremely rare. It's very hard to do, but he had a unique personality that was able to do it. Another way he changed the world and the Republican Party and the right was he was once asked, by his national security advisor, Richard Allen, what's your strategy for the Cold War? And Reagan told him, he said, we win, they lose.
Yeah.
And you know what? We won.
We did.
And partly, I think almost mainly, because of the policies Reagan began to put in place during his first term as president. The paradox is, once America won the Cold War, once the Soviet Union disintegrated, once communism ceased to be the overarching issue guiding America, the right didn't have that glue. It didn't have something that all the different groups could agree on. And so in a way, Reagan's victory was ironic because he was the most successful Republican president of the 20th century, in my view. But he also laid the groundwork for the disintegration of that coalition that had put him into power.
Yeah, and it's upsetting a little bit that coalition was relying on communism to be anti-communist. Conservatism stands for so much more than that. And look, I think there's more hope than there was 20 years ago, just based on the thought leaders that are popular. I also think there's more opposition to that. I mean, maybe we just see a lot more of it because of social media and the rise of social media. But, again, I'm very concerned with a certain strain on the right that never would have won the Cold War and, in fact, would have lambasted Reagan anytime he talked tough to the Russians. That's a problem. I find it strange that they hail Donald Trump as their isolationist hero. That's not what he was. I actually really like Donald Trump's policy agenda overall, and his foreign policy as well. I don't think it's isolationist at all. I think it's highly pragmatic and transactional, which is fine. That's rational. I think. What do you think about the skepticism on trade? Populism is used to describe just other things that we can't explain oftentimes. So some people say that the skepticism of trade is populist. I don't know that it is. Is pure free trade a conservative ultimatum? Or can we discuss that? I mean, because I think it does make sense to discuss some of the costs and benefits of free trade, and question whether we even have free trade with a place like China.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the idea of reciprocal trade too, right? I mean, what's the point of giving away our technology when China has all these barriers and steals things and such? And of course, we didn't have a free trade relationship with the Soviet Union. And conservatives would have never supported that.
Yeah,
right? And in fact, during the debate of allowing China to enter the World Trade Organization, many conservatives of the time opposed it around the end of the 20th century. So yeah, it's not a dogmatic belief that conservatives have to be pro-free trade. The idea that we should enjoy free trade with our allies was a big part of Cold War era conservatism, post-World War II conservatism, where you really see a shift in conservatives' attitudes toward the overseas, right? Whereas conservatives had been non-interventionist, they were now supported alliances such as NATO. They now supported forward defense in ways they hadn't before. They supported interventions like in Korea and Vietnam. They just disagreed with the way that the Democratic presidents of the time fought them.
Yeah.
In a way that they had been protectionist when my story starts out. After World War II, conservatives begin to adopt a more pro-trade mentality, one, for economic reasons and the influence of libertarianism, but two, the idea that empowering the economies of our allies, which had been devastated by the war, was a way that we could fight communism. Because the more prosperous these countries overseas were, then the less likely they'd be tempted into entering the ambit of the Soviet Union. So it was a strategic
pragmatic,
means.
Yeah,
It
feels
was a
very pragmatic,
means.
which is how I look at it. I think Trump looks at it that way. I think we should look at it that way. And you're seeing that battle play out on the right. And I think it's a very healthy discussion. You know, this sort of economic nationalism ideal versus, I guess, economics 101, kind of all things lead to free trade. I think that makes a lot of sense domestically speaking when it's states competing with other states. I think libertarianism makes a lot more sense. It's a little bit more difficult to make those arguments when you're talking about international trade. And that's a healthy debate. I'm not sure we ever find a solution towards it. Do we get too dogmatic sometimes in our kind of inter-party squabbles where it's like, no, you have to believe this. This is the thing. It's not really what conservatism is. It's a process, right? It's how we think. It's how we solve problems. It's weighing consequences, second, third order consequences, weighing national interests, weighing infringement on personal rights and liberties. That's conservatism. And it allows us to solve problems properly. And so I think that debate is rather healthy.
Look, I mean, since the foundations of European conservatism and the writings of Edmund Burke, conservatives have been suspicious of theory and abstraction, right? And I think that applies to some of our debates on the right today, which is what works in theory doesn't always work in practice. And it's the conservatives who should be there to remind people of that. And so we need to be realistic about what is actually happening on the ground. And if the evidence shows that certain policies aren't working to the advantage of our country, then I think it's entirely appropriate that we reevaluate those policies. And I'd also say, to one of your points there has been a diminishment of the idea that the American right is a coalition, right? So in my book, I talk about all the different types of conservatives there have been over the last century, and it's an endless list. It is a crowded forest. But for much of my history, from that post-World War II period up through really about 20 years ago, these groups tended to work together. They've tried to find areas of agreement, and they tended to think through, well, if we have public policy aims, how do we go about pursuing them? I think that has diminished lately, especially on social media, where everything isn't coalitional, it's factional. You know, and if you don't agree with me 100%, you're a heretic.
Right.
That I think we have to get
people
away
are striving. They manufacture these divisions. And this happens on the right way more than it happens on the left. The reason I say that is because and I say this often, it'll say across the spectrum of ideology in the U.S. Congress, your most moderate conservatives and your most hardcore right-wingers, I'm not sure what the real philosophical differences are between them. I really don't think it's a huge gap. I think there's a lot of differences tactically speaking. On the left, I think there's serious gaps. So if they're factionalized, it's for good reason. I mean, you've got the straight up socialist, and then your kind of typical Labor Party Democrat. There's a lot of daylight between them, but we just try to manufacture it, and I think there's incentives to do so. I think it gets you more clicks. I think it gets you more engagements. Again, rhino hunting is a very popular theme on the right, and I think it's extremely counterproductive and silly and childish, but it is what it is. But people just like to do it. It is what it is. One question I wanted to ask you is the Buckley-Bircher conflict. And maybe explain what that is real quick. And do we see elements of that today? Have we always seen it? Is there always going to be that? I guess today would be QAnon. Am I accurate in kind of assessing the parallels there? But speak about that for a second.
Sure. I mean, we've talked about the strengths and weaknesses of populism. One of the weaknesses of populism is its tendency to collapse into conspiracy theory. Right? You don't trust anyone. It makes it very easy for you to begin believing conspiracy theories.
Where truth is found in the deepest, darkest corners of the internet. If I read it on Fox, there's no way it can be true. But if I read it on this random website that nobody's ever heard of, well, I finally found the truth.
And it was very important for William F. Buckley Jr. and Barry Goldwater and the founders of the conservative movement in America that they be taken seriously by the left.
Or by just normal Americans.
By normal
left,
Americans,
right? Like these days, I don't care about convincing far leftists.
That's a great
they're
way to
they're
put it.
unpersuadable.
I
want to convince the people that are mostly concerned about just going to the grocery store today
kitchen
and when
table,
they're going to do that.
When they're talking at the kitchen table, do they take your ideas seriously? That's the way to put it. And so in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, they're confronted by this phenomenon of the John Birch Society, hugely successful grassroots organization that is anti-communist, but is run by a man who believes that President Eisenhower was a communist. And the conspiracies go on from there. And they recognized, these leaders did, that they'd have to dissociate themselves from the John Birch Society if conservatism was to have a future. If people, everyday Americans who are apolitical, when they talk about who they might vote for, they're not going to vote for quacks, right? So there is a long and complicated process of disentangling American conservatism from this group. The John Birch Society doesn't really end until the mid-1960s when, again, like many populists, the Birchers' conspiracism turned into an anti-Americanism, and with regard to Vietnam. That was really the break, right? And this just happens to be the way these things develop. You can see now, I think, the rise of conspiracy theories on the right and the left, but on the right, and it's important for conservative leaders to be able to reassert that idea that we want to be taken seriously by American families and by people who aren't political, who do not like what the liberals are up to in Washington, D.C., but they also don't want to get sucked into these endless debates and kind of,
right.
I do my own research type things, right?
Yeah.
And that's a temptation that's always present, and it's a temptation that needs to be resisted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a victim of it constantly. People believe I'm in the World Economic Forum, right? Because they added me to like a list of, like young, interesting leaders a few years ago. And I'm like, what is more likely in your head? Like, what is more likely that I take all these highly right-wing conservative positions and I vote this way? You think I just do it just to trick you? Like just to trick you because secretly the goal is World Economic Forum? I mean, or do you think it's more likely that they just added a bunch of people to a list and none of these people are associated with each other in any way, and you've made some narrative out of it? What's more likely? And this gets into basic analytical thinking. And I think this is how conspiracies really get drawn up. It's a lack of trust, and also a lack of critical thinking skills. If you're not able to discern information that's placed in front of you and establish what is likely, what is unlikely, you're going to fall down some strange, dark rabbit holes. Again, it's probably just a part of human nature. It's never going away. Sometimes it just materializes in certain places. And I wonder now if, because QAnon has been so largely discredited, but the people who believe in it maybe are looking for a home. And I'm wondering where that's going.
Yes, we saw that spread in the past couple years, and we see people on the right who were willing to play footsie with these conspiracy theories rather than calling them out. And I think for the right to have a future, for it to get not only to get back into power, which the Democrats seem to be doing their best to put the right back into power, but to actually succeed when in power, it needs to be able to dissociate itself from these kind of crazy ideas.
Fully agree. It's a good place to end. I will have fully pissed off plenty of people with this podcast, but I didn't say anything I've never said before. It's got to be said. So, Matthew, thank you so much for being on. Thanks for writing this book, and it's called The Right: 100-Year War for American Conservatism.
Thank you.